A Halloween Massacre, an original Halloween / Texas Chainsaw Massacre novella by Jeremy Terry. Prologue, August 9th, 1973. It was the hottest summer that Jebediah Bubba Sawyer could remember, which was really saying something when you were talking about summer in Texas. He looked out the window at the empty countryside surrounding his home and wondered at the fun shapes he imagined he saw in the blowing dust clouds. It hadn't rained in weeks, and everything beyond the thin pane of glass looked listless and dead. A blade of grass might snap in two at the merest touch of a finger. Jed caught sight of his reflection in this thin pane of glass and turned away in disgust. That was his ugly face, the bad one he was born with, the one he hid behind his better faces. His older brother, Drayton, was angry with him because he let the pretty girl get away, and because Nubbins was killed the day before. His punishment was that Drayton took away the faces Jed had taken from the other people. Jed liked having different faces to put on. He had a set of clothes that went with each face. His work face, his dress-up face, and his woman face that he wore a pretty dress with. Leatherface, that's what Drayton and Nubbins called him. They laughed at him and hit him. They called him things like retard and bedwetter. Still, they were his family, and he loved them. He wished Nubbins was there with him. It made him sad to remember the sound Nubbins' body made when the truck crushed him. He'd carried him back to the house after he lost the pretty girl, limping the whole way because he'd cut his thigh with his own chainsaw during the chase. He clutched the bandaged wound, moaning softly in pain. Drayton had sewn him up with twine and needle after they had buried Nubbins. Drayton said he would be right as rain in no time, but the fire in his leg only seemed to grow deeper as time went by. Jed wondered if he needed medicine. He looked up at the decorations hanging from the ceiling above him. They were wind chimes made of human bone and bound with dried-out sinew. Nubbins made each one by hand, from the leftovers of the ones they caught after Jed butchered them and Drayton cooked them. There were many wind chimes. Anger flared, and he clenched his fist. Nubbins would never, ever make another decoration again, and it was all because of the pretty girl and her friends. They'd come, as most of them did, like thieves in the night, trespassing on the family's land. The first two came right into their home, by cracky. It was a sin that could not go unpunished. Jed caught the first man by surprise, bursting from his butcher shop beneath the stairs and smashing his head with the mallet until he stopped moving. The girl came in just as he was pulling the man inside to dress him out. How she screamed as he chased her down the hallway. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her inside the butcher shop, where he hung her on a meat hook. He made her watch while he cut the man up with his chainsaw, prepping him for their dinner that night. The girl went into the freezer with the man's leftovers. The third one came to the house later, searching for his friends. He found them too. Jed watched from the shadows as the man opened the freezer and the mostly dead girl popped up like a jack-in-the-box. The sight almost made Jed chuckle. He'd rushed forward then and did for the man like he did for the first with the mallet. The man's head caved in and his mushed brains had squeezed out. Jed remembered thinking that Drayton was going to be mad with him for ruining the brains. Drayton liked to eat brains mixed with eggs for breakfast in the morning. It was a very upsetting day, and it wasn't over yet. Jed heard voices coming near the house. He grabbed his chainsaw and set out, coming upon the pretty girl and a fat, whiny man in a wheelchair. Jed hated the sound of the man's voice. It was like the constant braying of a donkey that he'd once chopped the head off of. The fat man didn't stand a chance because he couldn't stand, couldn't run. Jed jumped from the bushes and sawed the man's belly open, sending his shredded guts flying off into the night. The pretty girl saw what he did and ran towards the lights of Jed's home, thinking she would find help. Instead, she found Grandpa Sawyer sitting in his wheelchair. Grandpa doesn't look so good anymore, so she thought he was dead like Grandma Sawyer sitting in the corner. She screamed and ran, and Jed chased her all the way to Drayton's gas station. Drayton brought her back, and they cut her finger to feed Grandpa. The pretty girl didn't like that one bit, so she fainted. She woke up the next morning making a lot of noise. Drayton and Nubbins made fun of her some, like they made fun of him, and then they decided to kill her. They wanted Grandpa to do it, but Grandpa Sawyer just didn't have the strength he used to, and he kept dropping the hammer. That's when the pretty girl broke free and ran outside. Drayton ordered Nubbins and him to bring her back, so they chased her down the driveway to the road. That's where a truck driver ran over his brother and squished him. Jed tried to kill the man, but the man hit him with a wrench, hurting his head and causing him to cut himself with his chainsaw before running off. The pretty girl was the other way down the road, waving at another truck. Jed chose to go after her, and he almost caught her, but his injured leg slowed him down just enough. She howled with laughter as the truck pulled away from him, and he had screamed with frustration and unquenchable rage. So many bad things, and now there might be more bad things on the way. Jed grimaced as Drayton began to shout in the next room. He was talking with Cousin Dink about what they should do. Drayton didn't want to leave their home or his gas station to rot empty and abandoned under the scorching Texas sun. Dink saw things a different way. "You ain't got the brains God gave a gopher, Drayton Sawyer. Think things through, ye idiot. That Sally girl your retard brother let go has already made it to the sheriff. I'm surprised they haven't already come and beat down your door." "Well, what do you suggest I do? Take Grandpa and Bubba on the road in my old pick-em-up? That ain't no way for a man to live. A man needs a place to call his own, a place to put down roots." "Trees get moved and replanted all the time," Dink said. "You can't always sink new roots as long as you and yours are still drawing breath." Jed heard Drayton sigh and felt a twinge of pain in his chest at the idea of moving away from everything he'd ever known. The thought frightened him. He looked out the window and caught sight of a new plume of dust that hung in the air like a beige cloud. Someone was driving down the road near the house. "Fine then," Drayton said. "What do you suggest we do? Should I pack Grandpa up and Bubba up and move on into your place on the other side of the county? I suppose we could hide at the old slaughterhouse." The dust cloud was nearer. It pulsed faintly with red and blue lights. As it lit from below, a low sound reached Jed's ears. "Y'all know you're always welcome to stay with us at the home place," Dink said. "Hell, Ma would love the company. She hasn't seen hide nor hair of y'all in months." The sound was much louder now. It grew with each passing second. Conversation in the other room faltered as the blaring well reached the two men. "Dink," Drayton said, "is that—" A line of black vans and sheriff's cruisers crested a rise, their lights and sirens working. Dink had been right. The pretty Sally girl had reached the law. Anger coursed through Jed, and he loosed a shout to bring the others. Dink and Drayton were at his side in an instant. They leaned down and peered out at the new trespassers on their land. "Just look at those fuckers," Drayton shouted, kicking Jed in the side with a booted foot. "Do you see the mess you caused all because you couldn't catch one little girl? This is all your fault." Dink, a huge man, swathed in rolls of mounded fat, put his own boot in Drayton, sending the smaller man rolling to the floor. Drayton looked up at Dink and hissed. Dink slapped the side of Drayton's head with a meaty hand. "You can lay blame later, hoss," Dink said. "We gotta find a way out of here before they throw us all on irons." "It's too late to run," Drayton spat, howling with fatalistic glee. "The pigs are already here. Come with me. I got a few rifles in the kitchen. We're gonna have to shoot our way out." Dink paled, fresh sweat breaking out on his brow. He looked out the window again, saw that Drayton was right, and nodded, causing his fat jowls to quiver. "Well, shit," Dink said, following Drayton from the room. "I haven't had to kill nobody for a while. Living the peaceful life was kinda nice." Jed stood and lumbered along in their wake. Things were happening so fast, everything spinning out of control, and Jed did not like that. They walked into the musty kitchen, and Drayton flung open a box stowed beneath the sink. He pulled out 2 lever-action rifles, keeping one for himself and handing the other to Dink. Jed stood for a moment and then walked out to the front hallway and into the butcher shop. He walked past the freezer that held the remains of 2 of the pretty girl's friends and picked up his bloodied mallet and chainsaw. The trespassers would pay. He would see to that. And when he was finished, his family would have more meat than they could eat in a month. An amplified voice called from outside, so garbled by static that Jed couldn't understand it. Drayton must have been able to, however. "You can take your surrender and shove it up your ass!" And that's when the fight started. Gunshots rang out from every point of the compass, sending splinters of wood flying through the air inside the home. Buzzing invisible wasps hummed around Jed. One grazed his bicep, drawing a thin line of blood through his skin. Jed ran into the living room just in time to see one of the buzzing bullets strike Grandpa Sawyer in the bridge of his nose, splattering the ancient man's brains across the dirty floor. "You bastards!" Drayton screamed, firing his rifle empty. 2 FBI agents fell dead to the Texas hardpan. Dink dropped another man, but it was useless. 6 agents surged forward to take the 3 dead men's place. A bullet struck Jed in his already injured leg, and he collapsed to the floor, clutching the bullet wound and reopened chainsaw gash. He looked up, saw Drayton calling his name, and then a shotgun blast opened Drayton's chest cavity, pulping his lungs and heart. The thin man tumbled back into the center of the room like a rag doll tossed by a careless child. "Drayton!" Dink shouted, brandishing his rifle and shooting the FBI agent that killed his cousin. An object flew through the broken window to land at the fat man's feet. It looked very much like a black baseball. Then the baseball exploded in a burst of sound and blinding light, and Jed rolled away howling. He hit a wall and crawled to his knees, blinking away the flashbang's effects. He heard pounding footsteps and more gunfire. Dink cried out in pain somewhere nearby. There was an object at his right hand. He gripped it tight and lifted it, feeling the familiar weight. "My mallet!" Jed felt a presence looming over him, and he surged up off the floor with a shout of rage, swinging the big hammer. It connected with the agent's jaw like a bulldozer, shattering his teeth and jawbone. Jed raised the mallet and brought it down again, caving the terrified man's left cheek in. "Freeze, you freak!" Jed turned to see 4 agents converging on him with their weapons raised. Jed didn't hesitate, and neither did they. Bullets and buckshot peppered his body, setting nerve endings alight. He tried to lift the mallet with numb fingers, and it slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor beside the dead agent. Jed took a step and collapsed in a heap. He stared ahead at Drayton's corpse. Dink lay beyond him, his rotund belly and heavy chest dotted here and there with bright red flowers. "We got the sickos!" one of the agents shouted, pumping his arm in the air. Jed longed to lop off that with his saw and feed it to him raw and squirting. But he was suddenly so very tired. He closed his eyes to rest for a moment and felt darkness closing in. Jed fought against it and lost. "Would you take a look at that?" one of the other agents said. "This one is still alive." "How in blazes is that possible?" asked another. "We damn near blew him to pieces. I think he took a round in the head." "I don't know how it's possible, but it is. Look at his chest rise and fall. That sick freak is trying to pull through." There was more, but Jed couldn't make it out. He sighed and let the darkness take him down, where he wouldn't have to think about dead family or the pretty girl named Sally, who got away. October 31st, 1978. The shape watched them from the shadows at the top of the stairs. He remembered the little blonde boy the babysitter called Tommy. He met the boy outside the school earlier that very day after the other children bullied him and made him smash his pumpkin. The boy reminded him of another little blonde boy from long ago, back before the slashing, stabbing, bloodletting, back when the shape thought of himself by a different name. Tommy and the little dark-haired girl named Lindsay trembled in the babysitter's arms as she tried to calm them. He stared at them, breathing deeply, smelling the older girl's shampoo and the musky scent of all their mingled fear. The older girl's name was Laurie Strode. She burned like a searchlight in his mind, had from the moment he had laid eyes on her as she walked up on the porch of his childhood home. He stood a foot away on the other side of the front door as she placed a set of keys beneath a faded welcome mat. Oh, how he'd wanted to take her then, but another voice had whispered he must wait. So he followed her as she went to school and then home, followed her as she and her friend drove across town to babysit the two little children. "Sister," whispered the voice. He saw Laurie's face change to the screaming face of his long-dead sister Judith. Why should that be? The two had only a passing resemblance with each other. But the voice was insistent. It made his blood boil. He wanted to feel Laurie's hot blood run over his hands like Judith's did, wanted to stare into her eyes as she took her last breath. Tommy glanced up and screamed, "Laurie, it's the boogeyman!" Laurie moved fast, pushing the two little kids into the open door to his right, ordering them to lock the door. They did, and she spun and ran into the open door opposite. Foolish. They were on the second floor. Where could she possibly escape to? He stalked forward with his butcher knife in hand and stepped inside after her. There was a bed against the wall and glass doors to his right that led out onto a narrow balcony looking out on the front yard and the dark street beyond. He took a step towards the door, thinking she might have tried to jump, and then he paused as faint whispering came from the closed closet door to his left. She was there. Her race was run and there was nowhere else to go. He crossed the room and yanked the door handle. The doors gave a little, but would not open. He pulled harder, but they would not give. She secured it from the inside with a necktie or a belt. It didn't matter. Nothing would keep him from her. He lashed out with the knife's pommel and smashed the flimsy wooden slats. 3 blows and the hole was large enough to fit his upper body through. He leaned in and looked down to see her crouched on the closet floor. Only she wasn't paralyzed with fear. There was something long and thin in her hand. She thrust it up and fresh pain bloomed a centimeter from his eye. He dropped the knife, clutching at his wounded face. A flash of movement and she plunged 2 inches of the butcher knife into his stomach. He stumbled back and fell to the carpeted floor. Laurie emerged from her refuge a moment later, eyeing him warily. She stepped over him and shuffled out into the hallway. The shape heard her knock on the bathroom door and tell the children the boogeyman was dead. She told them to run down the street and have the neighbors call the sheriff. He waited and watched. She still hadn't moved from her spot just outside the door. He heard the front door downstairs slam and the children scream for help, slowly diminishing as they fled up the street. It was time. He sat up and got to his feet. Blood ran down his cheek from the small puncture wound there. More ran from the wound in his stomach, making the front of his coveralls red. He reached the doorway as he took a step towards the stairs. He would not be thwarted again. He grabbed her by the throat and squeezed. She surprised him, as she had done several times over the course of this night. One look at her would tell you she was exhausted to the point of collapse, yet she fought him like a wild animal. She grabbed his mask and pushed it up, exposing the face underneath. He let her go and pulled the mask back on. Footsteps at the top of the stairs. He turned to see a familiar figure pointing a revolver at him. It was his doctor from Smith's Grove Sanitarium, Dr. Samuel Lewis. The shape took a step towards Laurie and Loomis fired the gun. The bullet struck the shape in the left side, breaking a rib and knocking him back into the room. Loomis was on him in a second, firing the remaining 5 rounds into him. The shape fell back through the glass doors and over the patio's railing. He tumbled on the grass 15 feet below and came to rest on his back, looking up at the stars in the night sky. A second later, Loomis peered over the rail and saw him. He would be down in a minute or less. The shape had to get away before Loomis could take him back to Smith's Grove. He turned over onto his stomach and began to crawl across the grass towards a wooded lot at the rear of the house. Each foot gained was agony, each bullet and stab wound singing. He heard Loomis's frantic footsteps and then car tires on the street. He reached the edge of the woods and passed into the midnight darkness under the bow. Raised voices drew near. Loomis and another man. They would be on him in seconds. He tried to stand so he could flee or fight and found he could not. He felt weak, lightheaded. Stars began to explode at the edges of his vision. 2 shapes appeared above him. Loomis brandished the revolver, thumbed the hammer back. He aimed at the shape's head. "Loomis, no!" The other person was dressed in a sheriff's uniform. He lunged forward and forced the gun's muzzle skyward. "It has to be done, Brackett," Loomis said. "Michael Myers is evil, pure and simple. He can't be allowed to keep going, or nights like tonight will happen again and again. Don't you understand? He's a monster." Brackett didn't loosen his grip. "He may be a monster. He may be the most evil son of a bitch to ever walk the earth, but it doesn't change things. Look at him. He's completely helpless. Hell, he'll probably bleed to death before we can get him to the hospital anyway. The point is that shooting him now would be cold-blooded murder. You'd be no better than him." Loomis hissed out breath, shaking Brackett off. "I can live with that if it means no one else will ever die at his hands." Brackett shook his head. "Maybe you can, but I can't. Holster the gun now." Loomis hesitated for a moment and then stowed the revolver back in a trench coat pocket. The shape heard metal clink against metal, felt cold steel cinch down on his wrist. The last of the fight went out of him then. He was theirs. Soon he would be back in his cell at Smith's Grove, where Dr. Loomis would pump him full of drugs that fogged his brain and kept him safe. It might be so for a time, but he was a patient monster, and Halloween would come around again. It was only a matter of time. Happy Halloween, Slashaholics. I hope you're all having a great, creepy, scary, spooky, whatever you want to call it, Halloween 2024. This is like Christmas. This time of year is Christmas to me and my family. We love Halloween so much. Watching some scary movies, putting out this narration. I've been putting out, lots of slasher novelizations and stuff 24/7 on the channel as lives, so you can catch them any time of day. And I promised I would put out the prologue of this book, A Halloween Massacre by Jeremy Terry. This has been the prologue, and I love that we got the backstory on Leatherface and Michael Myers. This book is going to pit them against each other, and I cannot wait to see that happen. Michael versus Leatherface is an interesting concept, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out. Let me and Jeremy know what you thought of the prologue of his new book. And like I said, happy Halloween, happy Samhain. Be sure to wear a mask out there so you're safe from Samhain. Yeah, this was a fun prologue. The backstory with what happened after the events of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You know, how Leatherface was taken into custody. And then we get the end of Halloween 1. Michael Myers getting arrested. They're going to take him to the hospital. I'm curious to see how this is all going to play out, how they're going to end up pitted against each other. So yeah, Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, be excellent to each other, happy Halloween, and I'll see you next time. And also stay tuned for more chapters of Murder Report by James Acosta. More of those chapters will be dropping soon. And the final 2 chapters of Act 1 of The Curse of the Jersey Devil, a Friday the 13th story by Rashad M. Moore will be dropping very soon as well. Take care.